There's a part of human nature most people never see, not because it's hidden, but because they've been taught not to look. Not in school, not in books, not in the conversations people pretend are honest. It lives just beneath the surface, in the things people don't say, in the reactions they try to hide, in the patterns you feel, but can't quite explain. This is where we begin. Not with comfort, not with reassurance, but with something far more dangerous. Truth. Let me be clear with you from the very first moment. This is not a self-help book. You won't find empty advice about thinking positive. You won't be told that everything will work out if you just believe hard enough. And you definitely won't be comforted with the idea that people are naturally good. Because they're not always. And deep down, you already know that. But here's what's unsettling. You were trained to ignore it, taught to smooth over it, encouraged to replace reality with something easier to accept, not because it's false, but because it's uncomfortable. And uncomfortable truths have a way of disrupting everything. The way you see people, the way you trust, the way you understand yourself. So most people never go there. They stay on the surface where everything feels safe, predictable, controlled. But beneath that surface, there's another layer, a darker one, where people are not driven by what they say, but by what they want. Where decisions are shaped not by logic, but by fear, ego, habit, and quiet self-interest. Where intentions are rarely as pure as they appear. And once you start seeing this layer, you can't unsee it. Here's the part most books won't tell you. Life will teach you all of this anyway, but not gently. It teaches through betrayal, through confusion, through moments where nothing makes sense, until suddenly it does. And by then, the lesson has already cost you something. This book is different. It gives you those lessons before the cost. It shows you the patterns before you're trapped inside them. It reveals the mechanisms before they're used against you, not to make you cynical. Because cynicism is just another illusion, a defense that still refuses to see clearly. This is about something else entirely. Seeing clearly, directly, without filters. Because once you see, you start to understand. And once you understand, you start to choose differently. What you're about to explore are not theories, not opinions, but patterns, drawn from psychology, from history, from the quiet, repeated behaviors of human beings across time. Some of them will feel familiar. Some of them will make you uncomfortable. And a few will feel like they're speaking directly to something you've experienced, but never had the words to explain. Pay attention to those. The ideas that sting are the ones that matter most, because they point to something real, something unresolved, something powerful. This is not a lecture. It's a conversation most people avoid having, a mirror most people refuse to look into, and once you step into it, you don't come out the same, not broken, but aware, more precise in how you see the world, more deliberate in how you move through it. So take your time, question what you read, disagree if you need to, but don't look away too quickly. Because what you're about to uncover is not just how the world works, it's how people work. And more importantly, how you work. Welcome to the shadow side of human nature. Part 1. The truth about people. We start with the people around you, the friends, colleagues, family members, and strangers who make up the social world you inhabit every day. Some of what follows will surprise you. Some of it you already suspected. All of it matters. Truth 1. Everyone is the hero of their own story. Have you ever been in an argument with someone and watched in amazement as they twisted every single fact to make themselves look like the victim? Have you ever seen a person do something objectively terrible and then explain it calmly and sincerely in a way that made it seem almost reasonable? If so, you have witnessed one of the most powerful and universal forces in human psychology: self-justification. Here is the brutal truth, friend. Every single person you have ever met, including yourself, is the hero of their own internal story. This is not vanity or narcissism in the clinical sense. It is simply how the human brain is wired. Psychologists call it ego-protective cognition, and it runs so deep that most people are completely unaware it is happening. In 2007, social psychologists Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson published a landmark book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, in which they detailed decades of research on how human beings rationalize their own behavior. They found that the brain responds to information that threatens our self-image the same way it responds to physical pain, with avoidance, denial, and distortion. When we do something wrong, the brain does not simply accept that we were wrong. Instead, it quietly rewrites the narrative so that the wrong thing we did becomes reasonable, justified, or at least understandable under the circumstances. This is why people who cheat on their partners convince themselves their relationship was already over. This is why executives who make bad decisions double down instead of reversing course. This is why people who hurt you will often remember the event completely differently than you do. And they are not necessarily lying, they genuinely believe their version. The brain has done its editing so smoothly that the original footage is simply gone. What does this mean for you practically? First, it means that when someone wrongs you and then refuses to fully admit it, the problem is often not that they are a monster. The problem is that their brain has protected their self-image so efficiently that they no longer have access to what really happened. Getting an apology, in those cases, requires more than logic. It requires helping the person feel safe enough that their defenses lower, which is an entirely different kind of conversation. Second, and more importantly, it means you need to apply this knowledge to yourself. You are not immune to self-justification. None of us are. The research is clear. The smarter you are, the better you are at constructing convincing rationalizations for the things you have done. Intelligence does not protect you from this trap. It makes the trap more sophisticated. The habit you need to build is what philosophers call intellectual humility. The practice of regularly asking yourself the uncomfortable question. Am I telling myself the truth about this? Or am I telling myself a story? When you are in a conflict, before you construct your case, sit quietly and genuinely try to see it from the other person's perspective. Not to validate them, but to test your own narrative. You will be surprised how often there are details you are conveniently overlooking. There is a related phenomenon worth mentioning: the fundamental attribution error. This is the human tendency to explain other people's bad behavior in terms of their character. She is a selfish person, while explaining our own bad behavior in terms of our circumstances. I was under a lot of pressure that day. We hold others to the standard of their character. We hold ourselves to the standard of our context. This asymmetry is so consistent across cultures and populations that psychologists consider it one of the most robust findings in social psychology. The practical application is simple but powerful. When someone does something that frustrates or hurts you, before judging them, ask yourself what circumstances might have driven that behavior. And when you do something that frustrates or hurts others, before explaining your circumstances, ask yourself whether a character issue might also be playing a role. Understanding that everyone is the hero of their own story does not mean accepting bad behavior as inevitable or excusing yourself from accountability. It means navigating the social world with enough sophistication to work with the reality of human psychology rather than against it. That is the beginning of real wisdom. Truth too. Most people don't listen, they wait to speak. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. In the last conversation you had with someone, what percentage of the time were you genuinely focused on understanding what they were saying, versus quietly composing your next response while they were still talking? If you are being truthful, the answer might be uncomfortable. Research on communication has consistently found that most people listen at an efficiency rate of about 25%. That means when someone is speaking to you, you are processing roughly a quarter of what they are actually saying. The rest of your mental bandwidth is occupied by your own thoughts, your reactions, your plans for what you will say next, and your assessments of whether you agree or disagree. Psychologist Ralph Nichols, who spent decades studying listening at the University of Minnesota, concluded that the average person retains only about half of a conversation immediately after it ends, and only a quarter of it 48 hours later. This has massive consequences. It means that in most conversations you have ever had, both parties were essentially talking to themselves, with occasional moments of genuine connection. It means that the advice, the support, and the understanding that you thought you were offering was probably far less complete than you believed. And it means that the times you felt truly heard in your life, really genuinely heard, were rarer and more precious than you might have realized. There is a concept in communication theory called active listening, and most people think they know what it means. They think it means maintaining contact and nodding. But real active listening is something far more demanding. It means suspending your internal monologue entirely for the duration of the other person speaking. It means listening not just to the words, but to the emotion underneath the words. The hesitation, the emphasis, the things being carefully not said. It means asking clarifying questions, not to redirect the conversation to something you find more interesting, but to deepen your understanding of exactly what the other person is experiencing. The late psychiatrist and author M. Scott Peck wrote in The Road, "Less traveled, that truly listening to another human being is an act of love, because it requires you to temporarily set aside your own ego and your own agenda to make space for another person's reality." He was right. And the fact that so few people do it well explains why feeling genuinely heard by another human being is one of the most powerful emotional experiences a person can have. Here is something fascinating from neuroscience. When two people engage in genuine, deep conversation, what researchers call neural coupling, brain imaging studies by Yuri Hassan at Princeton show that the listener's brain activity begins to mirror the speaker's brain activity. The more the listener comprehends and engages, the more closely the brain patterns align. True listening is not passive. It is an active neurological process that creates a form of temporary mental synchrony between two people. So what do you do with this information? First, you can start watching for the pattern in others. You will begin to notice when someone is waiting to speak rather than listening. You will see it in their eyes, which drift slightly as they form their next thought. You will hear it in their responses, which often address not what you said, but what they expected you to say. Once you can see this pattern, you become far less likely to share important things with those people, which saves you a great deal of disappointment. Second, and more valuably, you can commit to becoming one of the rare people who actually listens. The social capital this generates is enormous. People who feel heard trust more deeply, open more honestly, and are far more likely to return the favor with genuine attention when it is your turn to speak. In negotiation, in leadership, in friendship, and in love, the person who listens best almost always ends up with the best outcome. The next time you are in a conversation, try this experiment. For the first 5 minutes, commit to genuinely understanding the other person without thinking about what you are going to say in response at all. Just listen. You will be amazed at how much you normally miss, and how dramatically the quality of the connection improves when someone feels, for once, that they are actually being heard. Truth 3. Loyalty has a price tag. This one is going to hurt a little, and I say that as someone who has had to sit with it himself. The brutal truth about loyalty is this: for most people in most circumstances, loyalty is conditional. It has a price, and when the circumstances change enough, so does the loyalty. Now, before you reject that, and think of all the loyal people in your life, let me be precise about what I mean. I am not saying that loyalty does not exist, or that no one is genuinely loyal. I am saying that the loyalty most people offer is not the unconditional, absolute loyalty that we imagine when we use the word. Most loyalty is better described as mutual benefit maintained over time, which is a real and valuable thing, but it is different from what the word loyalty implies. The research on this is sobering. Studies by sociologist Mark Granovetter on social networks found that relationships fall into strong ties and weak ties, and that in times of crisis, even strong ties regularly dissolve when the cost of maintaining them becomes too high. A 2019 study published in the journal Social Networks found that workplace loyalty in particular is almost entirely dependent on perceived reciprocity. People remain loyal to organizations and colleagues as long as they feel the loyalty is being returned, and exit quickly when that perception changes. History provides even more dramatic examples. The Roman philosopher Seneca observed that nothing reveals a person's true loyalties faster than a change in power or fortune. He was right. Studies of political defection consistently show that people who appeared fiercely loyal to a leader or cause abandon both when the situation becomes personally costly. This is not unique to politics. You can see it in business partnerships that dissolve when one partner becomes more successful, in friendships that fade when one friend's life trajectory diverges, and in families that fracture under the pressure of inheritance disputes. The reason loyalty is conditional for most people is not that they are bad or dishonest. It is that loyalty competes with self-interest, and self-interest is a very powerful motivator. When someone faces a genuine conflict between what is good for them and what is good for you, most people, after a moment of internal wrestling, will choose themselves. This is not a moral failing. It is human nature. The mistake is expecting otherwise. So what does this mean practically? It means you should build your life on a foundation that does not require any single person's unconditional loyalty in order to function. It means that when you are assessing who to trust and how much, you should pay less attention to what people say and more attention to what they have consistently done over time, and particularly what they have done when it was costly to be loyal to you. Anyone can be loyal when it is easy. The real test is when it costs something. There is also a positive side to this truth that often goes unnoticed. Because loyalty is fundamentally about reciprocity, you can actively build it by being consistently, demonstrably reliable and fair to the people in your life. Not by making grand declarations of loyalty, but by showing up when it is inconvenient, keeping your word when it is costly, and treating people equitably even when you have the power to exploit them. People who experience this kind of treatment consistently respond with genuine loyalty, because genuine loyalty is being modeled for them. You get back what you put out, not always immediately, but reliably over time. The most durable loyalties are built on a foundation of authentic mutual respect, shared history, and demonstrated reliability. Not on emotion alone, not on promises, and not on the assumption that the other person would do anything for you simply because the relationship is important. Build your relationships on what is real, and they will last. Build them on what you wish were true, and they will crack when tested. Truth 4. People fear your success more than your failure. Here is something that confused me for years, and I suspect it has confused you too. Why do some people seem to celebrate when you fail but become distant, critical, or strange when you succeed? If they are your friends, they should want you to do well, right? The answer to this confusion is one of the most psychologically rich and socially important truths in this entire book. Envy is one of the oldest and most widely documented human emotions. Aristotle wrote about it. Dante placed the envious in purgatory, with their eyes sewn shut so they could no longer see what others had. Every major religious tradition warns against it. And yet, for all its antiquity and universality, envy remains one of the least discussed and most misunderstood forces in modern social life, because people almost never admit to feeling it. Research by psychologist Susan Fiske at Princeton has found that envy is most intensely triggered, not by people who are radically different from us, but by people who are similar to us but slightly ahead. This is known as the social comparison effect. When your colleague gets the promotion you both wanted, when your friend achieves the success you have been working toward, when someone in your peer group makes a leap forward, the emotional response is far more intense and destabilizing than if a stranger or someone from a completely different world succeeds. The reason is that their success implicitly raises the question, why not? The brilliant but uncomfortable finding of this research is that your success does something very specific to people who are close to you and who have not achieved similar success. It forces a confrontation with their own sense of capability and progress. If you succeed at something they have not, They now have two options. Either they can acknowledge that you worked harder, smarter, or more persistently, which is threatening to the ego, or they can find a way to diminish your success. She got lucky, he had advantages. It will not last. It is not that impressive. The ego almost always chooses option 2. This manifests in subtle and not so subtle ways. The friend who stops calling when your career takes off. The family member who always has a criticism ready when you share good news. The colleague who responds to your promotion with a barely concealed lack of enthusiasm. The acquaintance who starts finding fault with you the moment you begin to stand out. These are not random behaviors. They are the signature of envy operating behind a social mask. Author and marketing strategist Ryan Holiday, drawing on the Stoic tradition, has noted that one of the most dangerous things you can do is aggressively publicize your successes in social environments where others are struggling. This is not because you should hide your achievements or feel guilty about them. It is because amplifying visibility amplifies envy, and envious people are often capable of subtle sabotage that can set you back significantly. The ancient wisdom here, found in cultures from Japan, where there is a concept called the nail that sticks up gets hammered down to tribal communities worldwide, is to move quietly when possible. Share your successes selectively with people who have demonstrated genuine goodwill. Protect your plans and ambitions from the early stages, when they are most vulnerable to being undermined. Not because you should live in fear, but because you should be realistic about the fact that not everyone who smiles at you wants you to win. On the flip side, when people you care about succeed, examine your own reaction honestly. If you find a complicated feeling underneath the congratulations, something tight, something uncomfortable, that is envy, and acknowledging it is the beginning of freeing yourself from it. Envy is a signal, not a character flaw. It tells you something about your own desires and insecurities. The question is what you do with that signal, whether you use it to sabotage others or to clarify what you want and work harder toward it yourself. Truth 5. Kindness without boundaries is weakness. Let me be very clear about something before we go any further, because this is a truth that is easily misunderstood. I am not telling you to stop being kind. Kindness is one of the most important qualities a human being can have. What I am telling you is that kindness without limits, without boundaries, without the capacity to say no, that is not kindness anymore. That is submission, and submission does not get rewarded with gratitude. It gets rewarded with more demands. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness, identified by Martin Seligman in the 1960s. But what is less commonly discussed is its social cousin, learned exploitation. When you consistently give to people without any limit, without any expectation of reciprocity, without any consequence for taking advantage of your generosity, you train those people, slowly but surely, to take you for granted. This is not a reflection of their character alone. It is a reflection of the dynamic you have allowed to develop. Research on social exchange theory, pioneered by sociologists George Homans and Peter Blau, found that healthy relationships, whether personal or professional, are built on reciprocity, not exact, transactional reciprocity, but a general sense of give and take, of roughly equal investment over time. When that balance is consistently tilted in one direction, when one person always gives and the other always receives, the relationship becomes inherently unstable. The giver grows resentful, the receiver grows contemptuous. Both outcomes damage the relationship, sometimes irreparably. The chronic giver is often motivated by deep psychological needs. The need to be liked, the need to feel valuable, the need to avoid conflict. Author and psychologist Harriet Breaker, in her book The Disease to Please, described this pattern as a genuine compulsive behavior driven by anxiety. People pleasers do not give freely out of abundance. They give anxiously out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish. And because the giving is fear-based rather than genuine, it creates resentment on both sides. The people who are most universally respected in any social environment are not the ones who give the most freely. They are the ones who have clear, consistent standards for how they expect to be treated, and who enforce those standards calmly and without drama. The word no in their mouths carries real weight precisely because they use it. The yes means something because there is also a no. The generosity is real because it is chosen rather than automatic. Establishing boundaries is not aggression, it is communication. When you tell someone that a particular behavior is not acceptable, or that you are not available for a particular kind of request, you are not attacking them. You are giving them accurate information about who you are and what kind of relationship is possible between you. That is a gift, actually, because it saves both parties the time and pain of investing in a relationship built on a false foundation. The practical step here is to audit your relationships. Make a list, mentally or on paper, of the people in your life, and honestly assess the balance of investment. Who consistently takes more than they give? Who makes demands without offering support in return? Who seems to lose interest in you when you are not providing something for them? These relationships are costing you energy that could be redirected toward relationships that genuinely nourish you. And then start practicing the art of the kind no. Not a hostile no, not a resentful one, but a calm, warm, clear no that says, I care about you, and this is not something I am able or willing to do. You'll discover something interesting. Most people, when faced with a clear and respectful boundary, adjust. The ones who do not, the ones who escalate, guilt trip, or withdraw entirely when you establish a limit, the ones who are not in the relationship for you in the first place. And knowing that is valuable information. Truth 6. Most people are performing, not living. Sociologist Irving Goffman published a book in 1959 called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And in it he proposed something radical, that human social interaction is fundamentally theatrical. Every person in every social situation is playing a role, managing impressions, and presenting a curated version of themselves to their audience. Goffman called this dramaturgical analysis, and over 60 years of research has confirmed what he suspected. The performance never really stops. This is not a new observation. Shakespeare wrote that all the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. But what is striking is how far the performance has extended in the modern world, and how many people have lost the ability to locate themselves beneath the roles they play. Think about how many people you know who seem to live for the image, the Instagram feed that shows a perfect life, while the actual life is in chaos. The confident professional persona at work that collapses into insecurity the moment they get home. The family man who performs responsibility and stability while privately feeling trapped and lost. The social media activist, the person who talks loudly and confidently about ideas they have never genuinely examined. The performance is not always dishonest in a malicious sense. Much of the time, people are not even fully aware that they are performing. The persona becomes so habitual, so automatic, so constantly reinforced by social approval that it begins to feel like the self. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask that we wear to navigate social life. And he warned that the great psychological danger was not wearing a mask but forgetting that you were wearing one. Research on self-monitoring, a concept developed by psychologist Mark Snyder, found that there is significant variation in how consciously people manage their self-presentation. High self-monitors constantly adjust their behavior based on what they believe their audience wants to see. Low self-monitors behave more consistently, regardless of the social situation. The interesting finding is not that one group is better than the other. There are advantages to each style, but that high self-monitors are systematically less happy in their close relationships, because genuine intimacy requires dropping the performance, and they have less practice doing so. The social media era has dramatically amplified the performing self. Research published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology found that time spent on social media is positively correlated with increased anxiety, depression, and reduced self-esteem. And the mechanism appears to be precisely this. People compare their actual messy, complicated inner lives to the curated performances of others, and they always come up short. You are comparing your backstage to everyone else's highlight reel. The way to navigate a world full of performers is twofold. First, you learn to read past the performance. You watch behavior over time, rather than accepting words at face value. You pay attention to what people do in low-visibility situations. When no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, when the social audience is not present, that is when the real person shows up. Second, you commit to your own authenticity, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a practical strategy. People who drop the performance and speak directly from their actual experience are magnetic precisely because they are rare. In a world of performances, a real voice cuts through like nothing else. Truth 7. People respect power, not fairness. Here is a truth that will make you uncomfortable if you were raised to believe that the world rewards good behavior. In most social, professional, and political environments, people respond to power far more reliably than they respond to fairness. This is not how it should be. It is simply how it is, and ignoring it will cost you. Numerous psychological experiments have demonstrated what researchers call status deference, the automatic tendency to defer to individuals who are perceived as high status or powerful, regardless of the actual quality of their ideas or the fairness of their positions. In a landmark 1963 study, Stanley Milgram showed that ordinary people would administer what they believed to be dangerous, electric shocks to strangers, simply because an authority figure told them to. The power of perceived authority overrode both personal ethics and basic compassion in a majority of participants. More recently, research by Dasha Keltner at UC Berkeley has found that the acquisition of power reliably produces changes in human behavior, including reduced empathy, increased impulsivity, and a greater willingness to violate social norms, and that others unconsciously accommodate these changes, rather than challenge them. Power, in other words, signals dominance, and dominance signals safety to the social brain, which is still running software written for tribal environments 50,000 years ago. What this means practically is that being right is not enough. Being fair is not enough. Being the hardest worker is not enough. If you are not also projecting a certain quality of self-assurance, decisiveness, and social gravity, much of what you do and say will be unconsciously discounted by the people around you. Not because they are bad people, but because their brains are running on ancient status recognition programs that predate logic and fairness by millions of years. The most sophisticated leaders and negotiators understand this and use it. They do not demand respect. They project the kind of calm, unhurried, grounded presence that triggers automatic respect in others. Research on leadership by Ron Riggio at Claremont McKenna College found that one of the strongest predictors of perceived leadership quality is not intelligence or expertise, but what he calls social expressiveness, the ability to control the emotional and energetic quality of a room. This does not mean you need to become aggressive, dominant, or ruthless. It means you need to understand the difference between substance and signal. You may have tremendous substance, knowledge, competence, integrity, but if the signal you are sending is low status, speaking apologetically, hedging every statement, accepting interruptions without response, agreeing when you should push back, the substance will be systematically undervalued. Work on the signal. Speak with more certainty. Take up more space. Let pauses do their work. Maintain your position under social pressure, not aggressively, but steadily. These are learnable skills and they matter enormously. And be honest with yourself about where in your life you have been expecting fairness to be enough. Where have you been working hard and waiting to be noticed, rather than making sure the right people know about your work? Where have you been reasonable and accommodating, in the hope that others would reciprocate, rather than advocating clearly for what you need? Fairness is a wonderful value, but as a strategy unaccompanied by power, it is often insufficient. Truth 8. The majority will always choose comfort over truth. I want to tell you about an experiment conducted by social psychologist Solomon Asch in the 1950s. because it reveals something fundamental about the human relationship with truth. Ash put a subject in a room with several other people, who were all secretly Confederates, actors working for the researcher. He then showed the group a series of simple visual tasks. Which of 3 lines matches the length of a reference line? The answer was obvious. What happened astonished even Ash. When the Confederates all confidently gave the wrong answer, a majority of real subjects went along with them, even though they could clearly see the answer was wrong. Not all the time, and not all subjects, but enough. About 75% of subjects conformed at least once across trials, to establish that social pressure can override clear visual perception in a majority of people. They chose the comfort of conformity over the discomfort of truth. This finding has replicated across cultures and decades. Human beings are profoundly social creatures, and the fear of social exclusion, of being the one who stands apart, who says the unpopular thing, who challenges the consensus, activates the same neurological regions as physical pain. MRI studies by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA have shown that social rejection literally hurts, using the same neural pathways as bodily injury. The brain treats being socially isolated as a survival threat, because for most of human evolutionary history, it was. This means that whenever there is a conflict between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable social consensus, most people will choose the consensus. Not because they are lying, and not because they are cowards, though sometimes it is one of those things, but because the biological cost of standing apart feels too high. The result is a world full of people who are going along with things they privately disagree with, saying things they do not fully believe, and silently watching wrong things happen, because no one wants to be the first to break the comfortable silence. You can see this dynamic in every organization, every political system, every social group. The researcher who sees flaws in the methodology stays quiet because challenging the senior scientist is uncomfortable. The employee who knows the strategy is wrong nods in the meeting because disagreeing with the CEO is risky. The friend group that continues a toxic dynamic because naming it would upset the equilibrium. The society that normalizes harmful practices because they have become the norm and challenging norms is socially painful. For you, there are 2 implications. The first is about other people. Understand that when the people around you are not telling you what they actually think, it is usually not personal, and it is usually not malicious. It is the deep pull of comfort over truth. When you want honest feedback, you need to create conditions where honesty is safe, where you are visibly receptive to criticism, where there are no obvious social costs for disagreeing with you. Without those conditions, you will get comfortable lies by default. The second is about yourself. When was the last time you said something true that was socially inconvenient? When did you last name a dynamic that everyone was dancing around? When did you last change your mind because the evidence required it? Even when changing your mind meant admitting you were wrong. The capacity for honesty, with yourself and with others, is a muscle, and like all muscles, it atrophies without use. Practice telling small truths every day, and the big ones will come easier when they matter. Part 2. The truth about power. Power is not a dirty word. It is a reality of every human interaction. Understanding how it works and how it is built is not cynicism, it is literacy. Truth 9. Silence is the most misread power move. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. Ask someone a challenging question and watch what happens. Within 2 or 3 seconds, they start filling the space with words that have not been fully formed yet, with hedges and qualifications, with nervous laughter. The silence feels like a problem to be solved. And this discomfort is precisely what makes silence so powerful in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. Research by communication scholars found that in negotiations, the party who speaks last and least consistently extracts better terms. This is counterintuitive. We tend to assume that the person who talks most, who argues most vigorously, who makes the most elaborate case is the most powerful. But in reality, the constant talker is often the more desperate party. Speech in a negotiation or confrontation often signals anxiety, the need to convince, to manage, to fill the space. Silence signals sufficiency, the confidence to let the other person come to you. Former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss, in his book Never Split the Difference, describes the technique he calls the late-night FM DJ voice, a calm, slow, quiet delivery that immediately establishes a sense of unhurried authority. He notes that the single most underused tool in any difficult conversation is the pause, the willingness to stop speaking, let your point sit in the room, and let the other person process it without rushing to fill the space yourself. In leadership, the dynamics are even more pronounced. Research on executive communication found that leaders who speak less in group settings, but when they do speak, do so with deliberateness and clarity, are consistently rated as more authoritative and trustworthy than leaders who speak frequently and at length. The rarity of the communication signals value. Every word carries more weight when words are not freely dispersed. There is also a deep listening dimension to strategic silence. When you are not busy talking or preparing to talk, you are in a position to actually hear and observe what is happening around you. Socrates, in the Platonic dialogues, is famous for his question and pause method. He would pose a question, stay quiet, and let his interlocutor talk their way into a contradiction. He did not argue his way to truth. He listened his way to it. The misreading of silence goes in both directions. People who fill every silence are often read as confident and engaged, when in fact they are anxious and unable to tolerate ambiguity. And people who are comfortable with silence are often read as cold, disengaged, or even threatening, when in fact they are simply comfortable in their own presence, which is itself a form of power. Practice this in your next important conversation. After you make your main point, stop talking. Let the silence sit. Do not rescue the other person from the discomfort of processing what you said. Do not add qualifications or examples unless they ask. Just pause and wait. You will be surprised how often the other person will move toward your position simply to fill the space. And in the gaps of silence, you will notice things you never noticed before. The micro-expressions, the hesitations, the body language that tells you what is really going on. Silence is not emptiness. In the hands of someone who understands it, silence is one of the most precise instruments of communication available. Truth 10. Information is the real currency. In every social, professional, and political environment, there is a currency more valuable than money, and that currency is information. Who knows what? Who controls what gets known? What you know about others, and crucially, what others know about you. This is a game that is played constantly by almost everyone, and most people play it very poorly because they were never taught the rules. The philosopher Francis Bacon wrote in 1597 that knowledge is power. And for 5 centuries that aphorism has been repeated so often it has lost its sharpness. So let me make it sharp again. The people who know more reveal less and control the flow of information in any given environment consistently outperform everyone else. Not because they are necessarily smarter or harder working, but because they understand something fundamental. In asymmetric information environments, the party with more information almost always wins. Research by economics Nobel laureate George Akerlof on information asymmetry showed how dramatically outcomes are determined by unequal access to information in markets and negotiations. In politics, his classic example was the used car market. Sellers know things about the car that buyers do not. And this asymmetry allows sellers to extract prices that buyers, if they had complete information, would never pay. The same dynamic plays out in every human interaction, where one party knows more than the other. The information game has 2 sides, gathering and protecting. Most people are naturally focused on gathering. They want to know more, understand more, have more intelligence about the people and situations around them. But the protecting side is equally important and far more neglected. Every piece of information you volunteer about yourself, your plans, your weaknesses, your desires, and your insecurities, becomes a resource that others can use for your benefit or against you, depending on their intention. This does not mean you should be paranoid or closed off. It means you should be selective and intentional. There is a difference between authentic openness, sharing genuinely because it builds trust and connection, and reflexive oversharing driven by the need to fill silences, demonstrate relatability, or win approval. The first is a strength. The second is a vulnerability. A particularly important application of this truth is in professional environment. Research on workplace dynamics consistently finds that people who share their plans, ambitions, and strategies too openly, in the name of transparency, often find their ideas claimed by others, their opportunities preempted, and their vulnerabilities exploited. This is not a reason to be secretive as a general policy. It is a reason to understand that not every colleague who smiles at you in a meeting has your interests at heart, and that discretion is not dishonesty. It is wisdom. The corollary: learn to listen more than you speak in environments where information is strategically important. Let others reveal their positions, their concerns, their real priorities. Ask questions that invite elaboration. Become the person who knows more than they say, rather than the person who says more than they know. In any complex social situation, that person has a profound structural advantage. Truth 11. Whoever needs less holds more power. Here is a paradox that will change how you think about power in relationships, negotiations, and life generally. The person with the least need in any interaction holds the most leverage. This is counterintuitive, because we tend to think of power as the ability to impose our will. But in practice, power is much more about the ability to walk away. Economists and game theorists call this the BATNA principle, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Your power in any negotiation is directly proportional to how attractive your alternative options are. If you desperately need to close this deal, accept this offer, get this person's approval, or maintain this relationship, the other party has leverage over you by default. If you have strong alternatives and can genuinely walk away, the dynamic shifts entirely. Research by Robert Cialdini on influence and social psychology found that scarcity and perceived unavailability are among the most powerful drivers of desire in human psychology. What is rare is valued. What is freely available is taken for granted. This is as true of people as it is of goods. The colleague who is always available for every request becomes the one whose time is not respected. The partner who is constantly seeking reassurance becomes the one whose company is unconsciously devalued. The friend who is always there, regardless of how they are treated, becomes the one who is treated with the least care. This dynamic is captured in a powerful concept from depth psychology: detachment. Detachment is often misunderstood as not caring, but it is actually something more sophisticated. It is caring deeply about outcomes while remaining psychologically unattached to any particular outcome. The master negotiator cares about the deal but is genuinely fine without it. The confident romantic is genuinely interested in the other person, but is not dependent on their validation. The effective leader wants the project to succeed, but is not terrified of the consequences if it fails. The Buddhist tradition understood this millennia ago. The Dhammapada teaches that attachment is the root of suffering, not because desire is wrong, but because the suffering comes from the clinging, the inability to tolerate the possibility of not having what you want. Western psychology has arrived at the same conclusion through a different path. Research on anxiety consistently shows that the most anxious individuals are those most attached to specific outcomes, while resilient individuals are characterized by high frustration tolerance and strong alternative frameworks. The practical prescription is simple, but requires sustained effort. Build options in your career. Maintain skills and relationships that make you employable and valuable outside your current role. In your relationships, maintain your own life, your own interests, your own identity, so that no single relationship becomes the entire architecture of your emotional world. In your finances, build reserves so that fear of loss does not control your decisions. The more genuine options you have, the less neediness you carry. And the less neediness you carry, the more naturally powerful your presence becomes. This is not about becoming cold or calculated. It is about building the kind of genuine security that allows you to engage with people and situations from a place of authentic choice rather than desperate need. And the irony is that people are most attracted to exactly that quality. The confidence that comes from genuine sufficiency is magnetic, in a way that no performance of confidence can replicate. Truth 12. Reputation is built in seconds and lost in years. Allow me to tell you something about human memory that should reshape how you think about every public interaction you have. In a 2006 study published in the journal Psychological Science, researchers Alexander Todorov and colleagues at Princeton found that people form lasting first impressions of a stranger's competence, trustworthiness, and likability within 100 milliseconds of seeing their face, and that these snap judgments predict real-world outcomes, including electoral results, with remarkable accuracy. 100 milliseconds. Less than the blink of an eye. That is how quickly your reputation begins to be constructed in the minds of others. And while a single impression in isolation is fragile and easily revised, the problem is that early impressions create what psychologists call a confirmation bias filter. Once someone has formed an initial assessment of you, they unconsciously interpret all subsequent information about you through that lens. Confirming information gets amplified. Disconfirming information gets minimized or explained away. This asymmetry is brutal but important. It is far easier to confirm a negative impression than to reverse one. Studies on reputation, repair by communication. Researchers found that it takes between 5 and 10 positive interactions to meaningfully offset a single, strongly negative one. And in contexts where information travels fast, workplaces, social circles, online environments, a single damaging event can define you in the eyes of hundreds of people who have no direct experience of you at all, only the story. The historical record is full of individuals and institutions whose reputations were destroyed by single events that in isolation might have been understood as mistakes. The politician caught in a moment of hypocrisy, the executive whose private email became public, the athlete whose single act of poor judgment became their entire legacy in the public mind. What is noteworthy is not that these events happened. Everyone makes mistakes, but that reputation has almost no memory for the overall pattern, only for the most emotionally salient moments. The strategic implication is this: you must treat your reputation as a deliberate, ongoing construction. Not something that happens to you, but something you actively manage. This does not mean performing or being inauthentic. It means being consistently conscious of the signal you are sending, particularly in high-visibility moments. It means understanding that your reputation is always being formed, even when you are not paying attention, by people who will use their impression of you in decisions you will never know were made. Practically, be impeccable with public commitments. Nothing damages a reputation faster or more permanently than a pattern of saying one thing and doing another. Deliver on small promises before making large ones. Be the person whose word requires no follow-up, no reminder, no verification. In a world where many people are casual with their commitments, that quality alone will distinguish you. And guard your composure in difficult moments. The moments when people are watching how you respond to pressure, failure, or disrespect. Those moments define you far more durably than your best days. Truth 13. Most alliances are temporary arrangements. If you want to understand why so many political coalitions fracture, why business partnerships dissolve, why friendships that felt permanent fade, and why the colleague who seemed like your greatest ally can become quietly adversarial over time, the answer lies in a simple principle. Alliances are formed and maintained by shared interests, and shared interests are not permanent. Political scientist Hans Morgenthau, one of the founders of modern international relations theory, argued in his classic work Politics Among Nations that there are no permanent allies and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. This observation, originally about nation-states, applies with equal force to individuals, teams, and organizations. When your interests and another party's interests align, alliance is natural and easy. When they diverge, the alliance will strain. When they conflict directly, the alliance will break. Evolutionary psychology offers a complementary explanation. Researchers in the field of coalition psychology, including Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, and more recently Robin Dunbar, have found that coalition formation in humans follows an ancient logic of reciprocal benefit. We form alliances with people who can help us and who we can help. And we maintain those alliances as long as the benefit calculation remains positive. This is not cynical. It is the natural logic of social animals. The problem is when we mistake a beneficial alliance for unconditional solidarity. Research on organizational behavior has found that workplace alliances are particularly fragile, precisely because organizational interests change constantly. Mergers, restructurings, leadership changes, and market shifts regularly realign the interest landscape, and alliances that seem permanent reorganize themselves accordingly, often within weeks of a significant change. The person who was your greatest advocate under one organizational structure may become a competitor or even an adversary under a new one, not because they are disloyal, but because the structure that made your interests align no longer exists. The intelligent response to this truth is not cynicism, not a refusal to form alliances, or a determined self-sufficiency that alienates everyone. The intelligent response is a clear-eyed approach to alliance that separates what is real from what is wished. You form alliances intentionally, understanding what interests you share and how durable those interests are. You invest in alliances in proportion to their actual reliability, rather than their emotional warmth. You maintain your independence, even within alliances, so that you are never so dependent on any one alliance that its dissolution would be catastrophic. The most durable alliances are built on a foundation that goes beyond momentary shared interest, genuine mutual respect, real personal affection, a history of reliable behavior under pressure. These deeper foundations make alliances more resilient to the inevitable changes in circumstance. But even they are not unconditional. The realistic goal is not to find people who will be with you no matter what, but to build relationships deep enough that no matter what covers a very wide range of circumstances. Truth 14. Emotion displayed is leverage surrendered. Here is something that took me a long time to genuinely understand, because it runs against the modern cultural emphasis on emotional expression. In any situation involving power dynamics, conflict, or negotiation, the person who displays the most intense emotion is almost always giving the other party an enormous advantage. This is not an argument for becoming emotionally suppressed or disconnected. It is an argument for emotional intelligence, the ability to feel deeply while choosing deliberately what you reveal and when. Research on negotiation strategy consistently shows that emotional displays shift power toward the less emotional party. A 2011 study published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology by Gerben van Cleef and colleagues found that anger, in particular, has a powerful but complicated effect in negotiations. Under certain conditions, it can extract concessions, but it also destroys relationship quality and triggers counter-aggression that ultimately makes agreements harder to reach. Anxiety displayed openly reliably shifts power to the other side, because anxious parties make worse decisions, accept worse terms, and signal desperation that the other party will exploit. The Stoic philosophers had a sophisticated understanding of this dynamic 2,000 years before. Behavioral research confirmed. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote repeatedly about the importance of maintaining equanimity and even unshaken inner composure, not as a form of repression, but as a form of freedom. When you are unaffected by external provocations, he argued, you remain in full possession of your faculties and your choices. When you allow external events to hijack your emotional state, you surrender that possession. In practical terms, when you are in a difficult conversation and someone says something that produces a strong emotional reaction in you. That reaction is valuable information, but it is information for you, not necessarily for them. The question is not whether to feel it. You are going to feel it regardless, but whether displaying it serves your interest. Sometimes it does. Genuine emotion, expressed at the right moment, can create real connection, build trust, and communicate priorities that words cannot convey as effectively. But this is a deliberate choice, not a reflexive response. A skill to develop is what Daniel Goleman, who popularized the concept of emotional intelligence, calls emotional self-regulation. The ability to pause between stimulus and response, to feel the emotion without immediately acting on it, to choose your expression rather than having it chosen for you by your nervous system. This is a learnable skill, like all skills, but it requires deliberate practice. Meditation, specifically mindfulness meditation, has the strongest evidence base for developing exactly this capacity. One more dimension worth noting: concealing emotion is not the same as suppressing it. Suppression, pushing the emotion down and pretending it does not exist, is genuinely unhealthy and tends to produce exactly the kind of sudden, dramatic emotional outbursts that people were trying to avoid. Regulation is different. It means you feel the emotion, acknowledge it internally, and then make a conscious choice about what to do with it. This distinction is critical. The goal is not to become a machine. The goal is to become a person who chooses, rather than a person who is chosen. Truth 15. The person who controls the frame controls the outcome. Every conversation, every negotiation, every decision, every conflict, all of these take place within a frame. The frame is the set of assumptions, definitions, and perspectives that define what is being discussed and how. And the person who sets the frame before the conversation begins holds a profound structural advantage over everyone who arrives at the conversation after the frame has already been set. Linguist George Lakoff spent decades studying the cognitive role of framing in political communication, and his conclusions, summarized in his 2004 book Don't Think of an Elephant, are startling in their implications. Lakoff found that when a frame is established, it is extraordinarily difficult to successfully argue against it using the frame's own terms. The very act of engaging with the terms of a frame reinforces the frame, even when you are arguing against it. Don't think of an elephant, he wrote. And of course you immediately think of an elephant. A classic example: when an employer describes a salary offer as competitive, they have framed the conversation around market comparisons. If you respond by arguing about what you need or deserve, you are playing in their frame. A savvy candidate reframes the conversation. I am not focused on what others are making. I am focused on the specific value I would be bringing to this role. That is not just a clever reframe. It is a structural repositioning that changes what the conversation is about. In politics, whoever defines what a policy debate is really about, whether it is about freedom or security, economic growth or inequality, individual responsibility or systemic barriers, wins the debate before it begins, because they have determined the terrain on which it will be fought. This is why the most significant political battles in any society are not about specific policies, but about the frames within which those policies will be evaluated. Research by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman on prospect theory demonstrated that the same information, presented in different frames, produces dramatically different decisions. In their classic experiment, subjects were told about a treatment for a disease. When described as having a 90% survival rate, it was strongly preferred. When described as having a 10% mortality rate, identical information, it was significantly less preferred. The frame, not the facts, drove the decision. You can use this understanding in every area of your life. Before entering an important conversation, think about what frame currently exists and whether it serves you. If it does not, what would a better frame look like? And how can you introduce it before the conversation gets locked into the existing one? This is not manipulation. It is communication intelligence. The people who do this naturally and unconsciously are the ones who consistently seem to get what they want, while the people who ignore framing spend their time making excellent arguments that somehow never land. Part 3. The truth about human behavior. Behavior is the only true revelation of character. What people do consistently over time, especially when the cost is high, tells you everything. What they say is interesting, what they do is the truth. Truth 16. People change only when the pain outweighs the comfort. If you have ever tried to help someone change, a friend with a destructive habit, a family member in a damaging relationship, a colleague with a self-defeating pattern, you have almost certainly encountered this truth in its most frustrating form. You gave good advice. You showed them the evidence. You were patient and supportive. And they did not change. And you wondered what was wrong with them, or what was wrong with you. Nothing was wrong with either. You were simply up against one of the most robust and well-documented principles in behavioral psychology. People change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing, not when they understand rationally that change would be better, not when someone they trust explains it clearly, not when the evidence is overwhelming. When it hurts enough, that is when change happens. Psychologist James Prochaska spent decades studying how people actually change. Not how they are told to change, not how we think they should change, but how they actually do it. His trans-theoretical model of change identified distinct stages. Pre-contemplation, no awareness or desire to change. Contemplation, aware of the problem but not ready to act. Preparation, action, and maintenance. The most important finding was that most interventions fail because they are aimed at the wrong stage. You cannot push someone from pre-contemplation to action with good advice. They are not at that stage yet. The neuroscience of habit formation reinforces this picture. Research by Anne Graby at MIT showed that habitual behaviors, the patterns we repeat automatically, are encoded in the basal ganglia, a region of the brain associated with procedural memory and automatic behavior. Once a habit is established, it does not disappear with insight or intention. It can only be interrupted by creating a new routine that captures the same neurological reward. And the brain will not build that new routine until the old one becomes sufficiently costly. This has two major practical implications. First, it liberates you from the frustration of trying to change people who are not ready. You cannot make someone ready. What you can do is make the consequences of their behavior clearer and more immediate. Not as punishment, but as honest feedback. And you can stop shielding them from those consequences. Because shielding someone from the natural results of their behavior is one of the most efficient ways to delay their growth indefinitely. Second, it directs your attention to your own pattern. Where in your life are you enduring a pain that has not yet reached the threshold? Where are you tolerating something? A bad habit, a toxic situation, a self-defeating story, because changing feels harder than continuing. The question worth sitting with is not, should I change this? You probably already know the answer. The question is, what would make the cost of not changing feel real enough that I finally act? Sometimes you need to feel the full weight of what you are choosing before you can genuinely choose otherwise. Truth 17. Guilt is often used as a control mechanism. Guilt is one of the most important moral emotions in human psychology. When it is genuine, when it arises from a real transgression of your own values, it is a healthy signal that something needs to be repaired. Genuine guilt keeps relationships honest, communities cohesive, and individuals morally accountable. It is a feature of a well-functioning conscience, not a bug. But there is another kind of guilt that has nothing to do with genuine transgression. This is guilt that has been deliberately installed by another person in order to manage your behavior. It is guilt as a control mechanism. And once you learn to recognize it, you will see it operating everywhere. In families, in friendships, in religious institutions, in political rhetoric and advertising, and in intimate relationships. Research by psychologists Roland Miller and Mark Leary on social emotions found that guilt and shame are susceptible to being triggered by external social pressure, independent of actual wrongdoing. Human beings are so sensitive to social disapproval, and so motivated to restore harmony in relationships, that skilled manipulators can reliably induce guilt in others simply by communicating disappointment, withdrawal of affection, or implied accusation, even when the target of these signals has done nothing genuinely wrong. The markers of weaponized guilt are distinct from genuine guilt once you know what to look for. Genuine guilt says, "I did something that conflicts with my values and I need to repair it." Weaponized guilt says, "Someone important to me is signaling displeasure, and I feel compelled to fix it regardless of whether I did anything wrong." Genuine guilt is internally referenced. It comes from your own assessment of your actions. Weaponized guilt is externally triggered. It comes from someone else's reaction, independent of what you actually did. Some of the most common guilt induction tactics are deeply familiar. "After everything I have done for you, I just thought you cared more than this. You have really disappointed me. I would never treat you the way you treat me." These statements are designed to do one thing: make you feel that you owe something, that you have failed someone, that you are a lesser person than you should be, and therefore that you should comply with whatever the other person wants in order to restore the relationship and your self-image. The antidote begins with a simple diagnostic question. Have I actually done something wrong? Not has this person communicated displeasure, but did my behavior violate a genuine ethical standard? If the answer is yes, repair it, genuinely and willingly, not just to end the uncomfortable feeling. If the answer is no, if you have simply exercised a right, declined a request, asserted a preference, or refused to participate in something harmful, then the guilt you feel is information about the relationship dynamic, not information about your moral status. Building immunity to weaponized guilt is one of the most liberating things you can do, because it relocates moral authority back where it belongs, inside you. You become accountable to your own values, rather than to whoever is most skilled at making you feel bad. This does not make you less ethical. It makes you far more so, because your ethics are now yours, rather than rented from whoever happens to be applying the most pressure. Truth 18. Flattery and admiration are often disguised envy. There is a famous quote, often attributed to Oscar Wilde: "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness." Whether or not Wilde said it, the insight is sharp. People who admire you often want what you have. And people who want what you have are not always, or even usually, on your side. Research on envy by social psychologist Richard Smith at the University of Kentucky has identified two distinct forms of envy. The first is benign envy, a motivating emotion that makes you want to achieve what the admired person has achieved, without wanting to diminish their achievement. The second is malicious envy, a destructive emotion that focuses on pulling the admired person down rather than lifting yourself up. His research found that which form envy takes depends significantly on whether the perceived gap feels changeable or permanent. When people believe they could achieve what you have achieved, benign envy is more likely. When the gap feels permanent or unjust, malicious envy predominates. The challenge is that both forms of envy often wear the same social mask: vocal, enthusiastic admiration. People who are deeply envious of you will often praise you most loudly, because the performance of admiration temporarily relieves the psychological discomfort of envy. Watching you succeed in the company of others feels less threatening than watching you succeed alone. The praise is real, and the envy is real. They coexist without apparent contradiction in the same person. When your success is cost-free to the other person, when it does not diminish their own standing or compete with their own ambitions, genuine support is easy and can be taken at face value. When your success represents something they wanted, or when it elevates you to a position that diminishes them by comparison, pay very careful attention to how the support holds up. Does it remain when the attention around you is not watching? Does it survive the moments when your success is most vivid and their progress is most stagnant? Genuine support does. Envious admiration does not. There is an important corollary about the people who are quiet about your success rather than loudly enthusiastic. Quiet approval, a genuine nod, a small and private acknowledgement, a brief but sincere word, is often worth far more than the most effusive public praise. People who are genuinely secure in themselves and genuinely happy for you rarely need to perform it. The performance is usually for someone else's benefit or their own. What do you do with this knowledge? You pay attention. You observe who is present in your life, not just when you are rising, but when you are struggling. You notice who celebrates your wins in private as well as in public. You register the difference between people who are energized by your success and people who seem subtly depleted by it. And you invest your trust and your intimacy selectively based on what you observe rather than what you hear. The people who can genuinely rejoice in your success are among the rarest and most precious relationships you will ever have. When you find them, keep them close. Truth 19. People treat you according to how you see yourself. I want to tell you about something that took me years to fully believe, because it sounds like something off a motivational poster, and it is actually one of the most empirically well-supported truths in social psychology. The way people treat you is a remarkably accurate reflection of how you treat yourself, not in every single interaction, not with every individual, but as a consistent pattern across your social life. This is the phenomenon psychologists call behavioral confirmation or self-fulfilling prophecy. It works like this. You carry a set of beliefs about who you are, what you deserve, and how you can expect to be treated. These beliefs shape your behavior, how you enter rooms, how you make requests, how you respond to poor treatment, how you carry yourself under pressure. Other people pick up on these behavioral signals and calibrate their treatment of you accordingly. Most of this happens below the level of conscious awareness, on both sides. In a foundational 1977 experiment by Mark Snyder, Elizabeth Tank, and Ellen Burchard, male subjects were led to believe they were talking to either an attractive or unattractive woman. They only saw a photo, which was manipulated. When they believed they were talking to an attractive woman, they were warmer, more engaged, and more socially skilled. And the woman on the other end of the phone, who had no idea what photo the man had seen, responded in kind, becoming warmer and more engaged herself. The belief in the man's mind produced behaviors that produced a real response in the other person. Expectation became reality. Research by psychologist William Swan on self-verification theory adds another layer. People do not merely accept whatever treatment comes their way. They actively, if unconsciously, seek out and elicit treatment that is consistent with their self-image. People with low self-worth seek out partners who treat them poorly, not because they enjoy it, but because it is familiar and confirms their internal model of themselves. People with strong self-regard tend to attract and maintain relationships that are respectful and equitable, because they respond to poor treatment in ways that either correct it or end the relationship. The brutal corollary is this: if you are consistently being treated poorly, undervalued, exploited, or dismissed in multiple different relationships and contexts, the common factor is you, not your bad luck, not the unique badness of every person you encounter. The way you see yourself, and the signals your behavior is broadcasting as a result of that self-image, is teaching people how to treat you. And most people are very good students. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that this means the lever of change is in your hands. You do not have to wait for better people to come along. You have to do the deeper work of revising the internal standard, building a self-image that is accurate and whole rather than distorted by old experiences of being made to feel small. Therapy, journaling, deliberate practice in social situations, and the patient, consistent experience of being treated well over time can all contribute to this revision. It is not fast and it is not easy, but it is the most high-leverage work you can do, because it changes the underlying conditions rather than merely the surface symptoms. Truth 20. Chaos is often created intentionally. Not all chaos is accidental. This might be the most disorienting truth in this book, because we tend to have a deep cultural assumption that disorder is an aberration, something that emerges from poor planning or bad luck, and that everyone is working to resolve. Sometimes that is true. But there is another category of chaos that is deliberately manufactured as a social strategy. And once you understand it, you will see it everywhere. Psychologists and organizational researchers have identified a personality pattern sometimes described as conflict-seeking. Individuals who, consciously or not, generate drama, confusion, and interpersonal tension in their environment because it serves their psychological needs. These needs vary. Some people manufacture chaos because it gives them a sense of control. They know where the conflict is coming from. Some do it because drama is the medium in which they feel most alive. Some do it because confusion and instability keep others off balance and therefore easier to manage. Some do it because they are genuinely suffering and do not have the skills to express that suffering directly. Clinical psychologist Albert Bernstein, in his book Emotional Vampires, identified several categories of people who reliably generate chaos in their social environments and found that the pattern is often invisible to the people creating it. They experience themselves as victims of the disorder they are generating, not as its source. This is important. The person who seems most distressed by the chaos is often its most significant cause. The one who is perpetually in crisis, perpetually surrounded by drama, perpetually embroiled in conflict. This is not bad luck. This is a pattern. At the organizational and political level, the deliberate manufacture of chaos is a well-documented power strategy. Political scientist Gene Sharp, who spent decades studying nonviolent resistance and authoritarian control, found that creating and maintaining public confusion about facts, about who to trust, about what is real, is one of the most effective tools of authoritarian control. Confusion paralyzes action. When people cannot agree on what is happening, they cannot coordinate a response to it. This is not accidental in authoritarian contexts. It is the point. The signs of intentional chaos in a social environment are specific. Conflict that seems to resolve and then re-emerge in a slightly different form. Communication that is selectively incomplete or deliberately ambiguous. Misattribution of words or actions that creates interpersonal friction. And a pattern in which the same individual is consistently connected to the center of every drama without apparently causing any of it. These are fingerprints. Your strategy in chaotic environments has to be fundamentally different from your strategy in genuinely disordered environments. In genuine disorder, you help build structures, clarify communication, and reduce uncertainty. In manufactured chaos, these efforts will be undermined because the chaos is not an accidental product of disorganization. It is a deliberate product of someone's need or strategy. In those environments, the effective response is to refuse to participate, to insist on clarity and documentation, to keep your own emotional state calibrated, and to recognize when the energy you are investing is simply fueling the engine of someone else's disorder. Truth 21. The need for approval is a leash. Of all the truths in this book, this might be the one that costs people the most. Not because it is the hardest to understand, but because the need for approval is so deeply woven into the fabric of social life that most people cannot even imagine what it would feel like to live without it. Let me try to describe it for you. Psychologists define approval seeking as a chronic pattern of modifying your behavior, opinions, and self-presentation in response to perceived or anticipated social judgment. At its core, it is living with the primary question, what will they think of me? Rather than the primary question, what do I actually think? When approval is the compass, you are not navigating by your own direction. You are navigating by the perceived direction of whoever's opinion you are most sensitive to at a given moment. Research by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan on self-determination theory identified 3 fundamental psychological needs: autonomy, the sense of acting from your own values and choices; competence, the sense of growing and being effective; and relatedness, the sense of connection to others. Their decades of research found that psychological well-being depends on all three, but that autonomy is particularly foundational. When autonomy is consistently sacrificed to the need for external approval, the result is what DC and Ryan call introjected regulation. Doing things not because they reflect your genuine values, but because you are afraid of how you will be perceived if you do not. The social media environment has created a particularly potent amplification of this dynamic. Research by Jean Twenge at San Diego State University, documented in her book iGen, found that adolescents and young adults who grew up with social media showed dramatically elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and social comparison, and that a significant driver is exactly this: the constant, quantified feedback of likes, follows, and comments that reduces the complex value of a person's expression to a number, which is then used as a measure of social worth. The leash that approval creates becomes a measured leash. You know exactly how tight it is at any given moment. The escape from approval seeking is not indifference to others. It is the development of an internal standard strong enough to stand on its own. Psychologists call this internal locus of evaluation, the ability to assess your own choices, actions, and worth from within rather than from without. People who have this quality are not cold or antisocial. They often have deep, warm, genuine relationships, precisely because those relationships are chosen freely rather than maintained anxiously. The practical path begins with noticing. For 1 week, pay attention to every time you modify what you say or do based on how you think someone will react. Not the social adjustments that are simply politeness or appropriate context sensitivity. Those are fine. The ones to notice are the ones where you swallow a genuine opinion, abandon a genuine preference, or perform a version of yourself that is not quite true because you are afraid of judgment. Just notice them. The noticing alone begins to create a distance between you and the pattern, and distance is the beginning of freedom. Truth 22. Most people are not against you, they are for themselves. Here is one of the most relieving truths in this entire book, and I say relieving because I think it will genuinely reduce a certain kind of suffering you may have been carrying for a long time. Ready? Most of the difficult, hurtful, unkind things that people have done to you in your life were not personal. They were not primarily about you at all. They were about those people pursuing their own interests, protecting their own needs, and managing their own fears. And you happened to be in the way. This is not a rationalization for bad behavior. What happened to you happened, and the pain was real, and some of it was unjust. But there is a difference between unjust and targeted, and most of the unkindness in the world is unjust without being targeted. People who treat you badly are usually not lying awake at night plotting against you. They are lying awake at night thinking about themselves, their problems, their anxieties, their ambitions, their wounds. You are a secondary character in a drama that is fundamentally about them. Social psychologist Roy Baumeister, who has spent decades studying the perpetrator perspective in interpersonal harm, found something striking. When perpetrators and victims of the same harmful event were separately interviewed about what happened, the perpetrators consistently minimized the harm they caused, contextualized it within pressures and circumstances that the victim was not aware of, and expressed little ongoing concern about the victim's experience. Not because they were monsters, but because once an event was over and their immediate needs were addressed, their attention moved on. The victim, meanwhile, was often still living in the aftermath months or years later. The philosopher Hanlon's razor is useful here. Never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by self-interest. Most of what we experience as cruelty or betrayal is better explained as people pursuing their own interests without adequate consideration of the impact on others. This is still a moral failing. Consideration of impact on others is a basic ethical requirement, but it is a different kind of failing than deliberate cruelty, and it calls for a different kind of response. Practically, This reframe liberates you from the exhausting and self-perpetuating cycle of perceived persecution. When you stop interpreting other people's self-interested behavior as a referendum on your value, you stop investing enormous emotional energy in defending your value to people who were not making a statement about it in the first place. You simply see clearly, this person is managing their own needs, and that management happened to cost me something. What do I want to do about that, given what I now know about them? This is the beginning of what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control, the practice of clearly distinguishing between what is in your power and what is not. Other people's self-interest is not in your power. Your response to it, your choices, your boundaries, your ongoing relationship with them is entirely in your power. Focusing on what is in your power and releasing what is not is one of the most reliably happiness-producing practices ever identified. The Stoics built a philosophy around it. Modern psychology has confirmed it, and your own experience, if you examine it honestly, will confirm it too. Part 4. The truth about success and failure. Everything you have been told about success is partly true and mostly incomplete. Here is the rest of it. Truth 23. Hard work alone is not enough. I know this is uncomfortable to say, and I know it will make some people defensive, because we have built so much of our social mythology around the idea of hard work as the great equalizer. And hard work does matter enormously. We will get to that, but the hard work is all you need. Story is a simplification that has caused a great deal of suffering to a great many people who worked incredibly hard and did not get where they expected to go, and who then blamed themselves for a failure that was actually a misunderstanding about how success works. Research by economists Raj Chetty and colleagues at Harvard and Stanford, analyzing decades of income mobility data, found that the single most powerful predictor of economic success in the United States is not individual effort, intelligence, or character. It is where you were born, to whom, in what social network, with access to what resources. A child born in the 90th income percentile who puts in minimal effort is more likely to remain in that percentile than a child born in the 10th percentile who works twice as hard. This is not a moral statement about what should be true. It is an empirical statement about what is. Beyond structural advantage success requires, in addition to hard work, strategic positioning. You have to be working hard in the right direction, on the right problems, visible to the right people at the right time. Malcolm Gladwell's popularization of Day Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice in outliers highlighted not just that 10,000 hours of practice produces expertise, but that the people who accumulated those hours had access to practice opportunities that most of their contemporaries did not. The Beatles had Hamburg. Bill Gates had a time-sharing terminal at Lakeside School. The work was real, and the structural advantage that made the work possible was also real. Timing matters in ways that are often underappreciated. Research on startup success by economist Scott Stern and colleagues found that market timing, whether you enter a field before, during, or after the optimal moment of market growth, predicts success more strongly than the quality of the product or the effort of the team. This is humbling for people who believe quality and effort are sufficient, but it is important. Working extremely hard at the wrong time or in the wrong direction produces exhaustion, not results. So what should you take from this? First, that hard work is necessary but not sufficient. It is the table stakes, the entry fee that gets you in the game. But once you are in the game, you also need to think strategically about positioning. Are you in an environment and field where your specific strengths have the most leverage? Visibility. Do the right people know about your work? Timing. Is this the right moment for what you are building? And network. Whose shoulders can you stand on? These are not shortcuts. They are the other half of the equation that the just work harder narrative leaves out. Second, let go of the moral weight you have attached to hard work as a virtue in itself. Working hard at something that is not generating results for reasons beyond your control is not a virtue. It is a strategy being applied in a situation where it is not sufficient. Recognizing that and adjusting is not giving up. It is intelligence. The most effective people in any field work hard and think strategically. The two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the thinking usually makes the work harder necessary and far more productive. Truth 24. Talent is common, discipline is rare. Walk into any school, any company, any creative community, and you will find talented people who have not achieved what their talent suggests they should be capable of. You will find brilliant minds producing mediocre work, skilled artists who never finish anything, intelligent professionals who plateau years before their potential would suggest. And then you will find people with moderate natural ability who have built extraordinary careers and lives. The difference is almost never talent. The difference is almost always discipline. Research by Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania, documented in her book Grit, found that the single most reliable predictor of long-term achievement across diverse fields was not talent, and not even initial performance. It was what she called grit, the combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals. Her studies of West Point cadets, National Spelling Bee competitors, and salespeople found consistently that grit predicted success better than any other measured variable, including cognitive ability. Neuroscience provides the mechanism. Research on skill acquisition shows that mastery is built through a process of myelination, the formation of a fatty sheath around repeatedly used neural pathways that makes those pathways faster and more reliable. Myelin is not produced by talent or potential. It is produced by repetition, specifically by focused, deliberate repetition over time. Every hour of truly deliberate practice is physically restructuring your brain, making the relevant skills more automatic and more refined. Talent provides a head start in myelination. Some neural pathways develop more easily in some individuals, but the final architecture is built by practice, not potential. The discipline gap is real and it is large. Research on self-regulation by Roy Baumeister found that the capacity for self-control is one of the most powerful predictors of life outcomes. More powerful than social class, more powerful than intelligence, more powerful than initial opportunities. His studies found that children with stronger self-regulation at age 5 showed dramatically better outcomes 30 years later in health, finances, relationships, and career, across all socioeconomic backgrounds. So why is talent more common than discipline? Because discipline is genuinely harder, not just logistically harder, requiring consistency, sacrifice, and the willingness to do unglamorous work repeatedly, but psychologically harder. Our brains are wired for immediate reward and the path of least resistance. The neural systems that produce motivation and reward evolved in environments where today's resources mattered more than next decade's outcomes. Discipline requires consciously overriding these systems, repeatedly over long periods of time, in the absence of immediate feedback. The good news, because discipline is rare, even modest gains in self-regulation produce disproportionate competitive advantages. You do not have to become a monk. You simply have to be more consistent than most people, which is a remarkably achievable standard. Build your routines around your most important work first, before the day erodes your willpower. Reduce the decisions you have to make about whether to do the work by building systems that make the default the right action. And be patient, not the passive patience of waiting, but the active patience of showing up consistently and trusting the process to produce results over time. Truth 25. Most people quit at the edge of the breakthrough. There is a cruel feature of progress that makes it almost impossible to perceive from the inside when you are in it. The gap between the effort you are putting in and the results you are seeing is often largest precisely at the moment just before everything changes. This is not a metaphor. It is a structural feature of how complex systems develop, and it is the reason that the graveyard of abandoned endeavors is full of projects that were one step away from working. Stephen Pressfield, in his book The War of Art, calls the force that causes people to stop just before they break through resistance He describes it as most intense and most vicious in the final stages. The point where the work is almost done, the goal is almost reached, the change is almost made. That is precisely when resistance seems loudest and most convincing, because that is when the stakes are highest. Quitting earlier would have cost less. Quitting now on the edge of the thing costs everything. The science of change curve supports this observation. Researchers studying both technological adoption and behavioral change have described what is often called the trough of disillusionment, a phase in almost every significant change process where results have not yet arrived to justify the investment of effort. In Gartner's famous hype cycle applied to technology, this trough follows the peak of inflated expectations. In individual behavior change, it corresponds to the period after the initial motivation has worn off, but before the new behavior has become genuinely automatic and rewarding. The trough is where most people quit, and the cruel logic of it is that the trough is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a completely normal, predictable, structurally necessary phase of the process. The people who succeed are not the ones who never reach the trough. Everyone reaches it. They are the ones who recognize it for what it is and stay in motion through it. Research on skill acquisition has a related finding. Learning does not progress smoothly. It progresses in discontinuous jumps, with long plateaus between them. These plateaus are not failure. They are the phase during which the brain consolidates and integrates new patterns before the next jump is possible. But they feel like failure because there is no visible progress. And so people who do not understand this structure interpret the plateau as evidence that they have reached their limit, that they are not talented enough, that the goal is not achievable, and they quit during the very phase that is preparing them for the next breakthrough. The discipline to continue in the absence of visible reward, past the point where most reasonable people would stop, is the final form of the grit that Duckworth studied. It requires trust in the process, not blind faith, but an informed understanding of how growth actually works. Keep a record of your starting point so that when you are deep in the plateau and progress seems impossible, you can look back and see how far you have already traveled. That evidence is often the only thing that will get you through the trough to the other side. Truth 26. Your network determines your ceiling. There is a principle in sociology called structural holes, developed by researcher Ronald Burt at the University of Chicago, that describes how your position within a social network determines the information, opportunities, and influence you have access to, independent of your individual talent or effort. People who occupy positions that bridge different social networks, who know people in multiple different worlds, consistently outperform people with equivalent or superior talent who are embedded within only one network. The structure of your social connections is a form of capital, as real and as consequential as financial capital. Sociologist Mark Granovetter's landmark 1973 paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, one of the most cited papers in the social sciences, found that when people found new jobs through social connections, the connection was almost never a close friend or family member. It was almost always an acquaintance, someone they knew casually in a different sphere of life. The reason is that close friends tend to know the same things you know, run in the same circles you run in. Weak ties connect you to different worlds, different information, different opportunities that are inaccessible from within your immediate circle. Research on innovation and creativity reinforces this picture. Studies of creative achievement in multiple fields, art, science, business, literature, consistently find that the most creative individuals are those with the broadest and most diverse social networks. Not the deepest networks, necessarily, but the broadest. Networks that span different disciplines, industries, cultures, and perspectives. Creativity, it turns out, is largely a function of combining ideas from different domains, and you can only combine ideas you have access to. The ceiling created by a narrow network is invisible but extremely real. You can only be referred for opportunities that someone in your network knows about and thinks of you for. You can only learn about possibilities that flow through the channels you are connected to. You can only be influenced by and influence the people you have access to. Talent and effort operating within a narrow network will consistently produce smaller outcomes than the same talent and effort operating within a broad and well-positioned one. Building a better network is not about collecting contacts or performing at networking events. Research on network quality by Brian Uzi at Northwestern found that the most valuable networks are built through genuine mutual exchange, authentic relationships where both parties offer real value to each other. These relationships develop through shared work, shared experiences, and genuine interest in each other's projects and problems. The networking that most people dread, the awkward event, the business card exchange, the forced small talk, is largely useless because it produces contact without relationship. The practical strategy is simpler and more human. Become genuinely interested in people working in adjacent fields to yours. Reach out to people whose work interests you with specific, genuine comments or questions. Show up for people in your existing network when it costs you something. Offer help before you ask for it. Make introductions between people who would benefit from knowing each other. These behaviors build the kind of network that opens doors, not because you manipulated it, but because you invested in it genuinely, and it grew around that investment. Truth 27. Failure is information. Shame is the virus. Failure is one of the most valuable things that can happen to you, provided you have the framework to process it correctly. This is not a cliché. It is a specific, testable claim that research in learning science, neuroscience, and organizational psychology has consistently supported. The problem is not failure itself. The problem is what happens when failure is fused with shame, because shame turns information into identity, and that transformation is where growth stops. Carol Dweck's research at Stanford on what she calls mindset found that individuals can be divided roughly into those with a fixed mindset, who believe their abilities are innate and static, and those with a growth mindset, who believe abilities are developed through effort and learning. The key finding is that these mindsets produce entirely different responses to failure. Fixed mindset individuals experience failure as evidence of their inherent limitation, a referendum on who they are. Growth mindset individuals experience failure as information about what they need to learn, a data point in an ongoing process. The neurological mechanism is relevant here. Research by Jason Moser at Michigan State found that people with growth mindsets actually show more brain activity, specifically in the anterior cingulate cortex. When processing errors, they literally pay more attention to their mistakes. Fixed mindset individuals show less brain activity after errors. They are in effect tuning the mistake out because it is too threatening to engage with. The growth mindset brain treats the failure as information to be processed. The fixed mindset brain treats it as a threat to be minimized. Shame is the virus that drives this tuning out. Researcher Brené Brown, whose work on shame has been described in multiple books and one of the most watched TED Talks ever recorded, distinguishes sharply between guilt and shame. Guilt says I did something bad, while shame says I am bad. This distinction is not semantic. It is the difference between information and identity. When failure triggers guilt, you can examine it, learn from it, repair what needs repairing, and move forward. When failure triggers shame, you are defending your basic worth as a person. And that is too important a battle to be learning from the specific mistake that triggered it. Organizations that create shame-free cultures around failure, that treat failure genuinely as a learning event rather than a career-limiting mistake, consistently outperform organizations that do not. Research on psychological safety by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School found that teams where members felt safe to take risks and admit mistakes showed higher learning rates and better long-term performance, despite, or rather, because of higher rates of visible error in the short term. You cannot learn without making mistakes. You cannot make mistakes without the psychological safety to acknowledge them. And you cannot have that safety in a culture saturated with shame. The practice you need is systematic, deliberate post-failure review. What the military calls an after-action review. When something goes wrong, create distance from the emotion before analyzing the event. Then ask, what specifically happened? What were the contributing factors? What would I do differently? What worked even amid the failure that I should keep? This structure treats the failure as data, not as a definition of your worth. And it is the structure that turns every setback into a competitive advantage over the people who avoid examining their failures out of shame. Part 5. The truth about yourself. We save the most uncomfortable territory for last. These are the truths about you. Your self-knowledge, your choices, and your capacity to change. They are the ones that matter most. Truth 28. You are not as self-aware as you think. Here is one of the most deeply awkward findings in all of psychology. Research published in 2018 by organizational psychologist Tasha Eurich found that while 95% of people believe they are self-aware, meaning they have accurate insight into their values, thoughts, emotions, strengths, and weaknesses, only about 10 to 15% actually demonstrate self-awareness when tested with objective measures. The gap between perceived and actual self-awareness is one of the largest and most consistently documented in the social sciences. You are very likely in the 85 to 90%. I say this not to be harsh, but because the statistics demand it, and because the first step toward genuine self-awareness is acknowledging that your current picture of yourself is probably less accurate than you believe. The specific nature of the distortion varies by person, but the general shape is consistent. We overestimate our virtues, underestimate our flaws, and systematically explain our behavior in the most favorable terms available. The mechanisms are well documented. Self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute successes to our own qualities and failures to external factors. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes the pattern by which people with low ability in a domain consistently overestimate their competence. And this effect is strong precisely because the skills needed to accurately assess your own performance in a domain are the same skills you lack when you are low in that domain. In other words, incompetence is self-concealing. Confirmation bias ensures that we attend to and remember information that confirms our existing self-image, while filtering out information that challenges it. Perhaps the most important and least comfortable source of self-knowledge is other people's honest feedback. Research by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia on strangers to ourselves found that in many cases, people who barely know, you can predict your behavior more accurately than you can predict it yourself, because they see your behavior without the elaborate narrational apparatus you have built around it. You know your intentions, they see your actions, and actions are more reliable data. This means that developing genuine self-awareness requires seeking out honest feedback with a genuine willingness to receive it. Not performative openness that collapses into defensiveness when the feedback is uncomfortable, but real structural humility. The people who know you well and who demonstrate genuine goodwill toward you are holding information about you that you do not have. Asking for it directly and listening without immediately defending yourself is one of the highest leverage investments in self-knowledge available. The journal is the other great tool. Not a record of events, but a reflective practice. Writing about your own behavior, motivations, and patterns with the explicit goal of finding the most accurate explanation rather than the most flattering one. Why did I really do that? Is a more valuable question than what does what I did say about me? Accuracy before self-image. That reorientation from the protective self-narrative to the accurate one is the foundation of real growth. And without it, all the ambition and effort in the world will keep running into the same invisible wall. Truth 29. The life you accept is the life you deserve. This is the hardest truth in the book, and I am going to ask you to sit with it without immediately becoming defensive. Not because I want to blame you for the difficult things in your life, many of which are genuinely not your fault, but because the part that is actionable, the part where your power lives, is in exactly this truth, what you continue to accept you are choosing. Every day that passes without a decision to change is itself a decision to continue. Psychology has a term for this: learned helplessness, originally identified by Martin Seligman in experiments with animals, and later confirmed in human populations. Learned helplessness describes the state in which organisms stop attempting to escape or change aversive conditions, even when escape becomes possible, because their previous experience has taught them that their efforts do not produce change. The mechanism is tragic. The experience of actual powerlessness, which was real, creates a psychological template of powerlessness that persists even after the actual constraint is removed. Many people are living in situations that are objectively changeable, jobs that are wrong for them, relationships that are damaging, habits that are diminishing their lives, environments that are holding them back and not changing them. Not because change is impossible, but because their model of themselves as unable to change has become more real to them than the evidence of their actual options. They have learned a helplessness that is no longer accurate. The philosopher and psychologist William James wrote in the late 19th century that the greatest revolution of our generation is the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. This was not wishful thinking. James was one of the most rigorous empiricists of his era. He was making an observation about the relationship between tolerance, what you accept internally, and conditions, what persists externally. What you normalize internally tends to perpetuate externally, because normalization removes the motivation to change. Here is the practical question this truth demands. What are you tolerating right now that you should not be? Not the genuinely uncontrollable circumstances. Those exist and they require acceptance of a different kind. But the things within your sphere of influence that you are living with because changing them feels hard or uncertain or uncomfortable. The relationship with the wrong person. The career that does not fit who you are. The habit that is costing you health or time or happiness. The city, the community, the situation that is wrong for you but familiar. Raising your standard, deciding that something you have been accepting is no longer acceptable, is not an event. It is a decision, followed by another decision, followed by 1,000 more. The first decision is the hardest, because it requires you to hold the discomfort of both the old situation and the change simultaneously. But once that first decision is genuinely made, the path becomes clearer. You are not moving toward an unknown future anymore. You are moving away from a known past that you have finally fully decided not to return to. Truth 30. The darkest truth most people will never change. We arrive, finally, at the darkest truth. And I want to be careful here, because this truth is easy to weaponize, easy to use as a justification for cynicism, for giving up on people, for a cold withdrawal from relationships into a kind of armored self-sufficiency. That is not what I am offering. What I am offering is something far more useful, an accurate picture of change, so that you can stop exhausting yourself, expecting it where it will not come, and start investing yourself where it will. Research on personality change over the lifespan, synthesized in a comprehensive 2018 meta-analysis by Brent Roberts and colleagues, found that while personality does change slowly and continuously across adulthood, generally in positive directions, the magnitude of change in any given individual over any given decade is small. Dramatic, fundamental changes in personality and character are genuinely rare, even over very long periods of time. The person who is consistently selfish at 40 was probably consistently selfish at 30, and will probably be consistently selfish at 50. Not because change is impossible, but because it is hard. And most people will not do the work unless they are in circumstances that make not changing sufficiently painful. Research on relationship dynamics confirms this in a different register. John Gottman, whose decades of research at the Gottman Institute made him one of the world's leading experts on relationship stability, found that in couples where certain destructive patterns were present, contempt, stonewalling, defensiveness, and criticism, the likelihood of those patterns changing without significant structured intervention was very low. And even with intervention, lasting change required not just insight, but years of consistent behavioral practice. The hope-based model of relationships. The belief that if you love someone enough, they will change. If you explain clearly enough, they will understand. If you are patient enough, the potential you see in them will eventually materialize, is one of the most costly and well-documented sources of sustained human suffering. Not because people cannot change, but because change requires the person changing to want it sufficiently and to work for it consistently. And no amount of love, patience, or explanation from an external party can supply that internal motivation if it is not present. What this truth asks of you is a form of acceptance that is profoundly different from resignation. Resignation says, "This is how things are, and nothing can be done." Acceptance says, "This is how things are, given what I know, and I will make my decisions accordingly, including, if necessary, the decision to remove myself from situations or relationships that require someone else to change in order to be livable." The people who change, who genuinely, fundamentally change in ways that stick, do so because something shifted internally that made not changing more costly than changing. You cannot manufacture that shift in someone else, but you can stop waiting for it. You can stop organizing your life around a future version of someone that has not arrived in years. You can make peace with who a person actually is, rather than who you need them to be, and decide from that honest place whether to stay or go, to invest or redirect. That decision, made from clarity rather than hope, from reality rather than wish, is one of the most loving things you can do for both of you. Conclusion. Now that you know, what will you do? You have traveled a long way since the introduction. 30 brutal truths about people, power, behavior, success, and yourself. Some of them probably felt like a relief, the articulation of things you had sensed, but not had language for. Some of them probably stung. The recognition of patterns you have been living with, patterns you may have been contributing to. Some of them may have made you angry, or sad, or uncomfortably reflective. Good, that is what this book was supposed to do. But I want to make sure, now that we are at the end, that we are clear about something. These 30 truths are not an argument for withdrawal. They are not a case for distrust, cynicism, or the kind of cold self-interest that masquerades as wisdom. The dark laws of human nature exist, and knowing them is not the same as endorsing them. A doctor who understands disease is not thereby endorsing illness. They are equipping themselves to recognize it, address it, and where possible, heal it. What I hope you take from this book is not a harder shell but a clearer eye. The ability to see people, including yourself, more accurately, and to make better decisions as a result. The awareness of when you are being manipulated, and the composure to respond rather than react. The understanding of your own psychological patterns, and the courage to examine them rather than defend them. The realistic expectations that will save you from the specific suffering that comes from expecting the world to be other than it is. Research by psychologist Jonathan Haidt on moral psychology found something beautiful in the empirical literature on human goodness. While human beings are undeniably capable of cruelty, selfishness, and tribalism, we are also equipped with powerful capacities for genuine compassion, cooperation, and self-transcendence. We are not one thing. We are simultaneously the worst and the best, capable of extraordinary darkness and extraordinary light, often in the same person, sometimes in the same day. The complexity is the point, and it requires complexity in return. The complexity of a worldview that neither romanticizes nor dismisses what we are. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to write one of the most important books of the 20th century in Man's Search for Meaning, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our power and our freedom. The brutal truths in this book are all, in different ways, about that space. About learning to see what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening, and about choosing deliberately in the space between what you observe and what you do. You cannot control whether people are self-justifying, whether loyalty has limits, whether envy exists beneath admiration, whether most people choose comfort over truth. You cannot control the fact that power is real, that silence is misunderstood, that information is asymmetric, that most people change only under extreme pressure. These things are true. They will continue to be true. What you can control is what you do with the knowledge. Whether you use it to exploit or to navigate, whether it makes you guarded or discerning, whether it leads to cynicism or to a kind of clear-eyed compassion, the compassion that sees people accurately, including their shadow sides, and chooses to remain engaged with their humanity anyway. That is the highest application of everything in this book. Not the closed fist of someone who knows too much and trusts no one, but the open hand of someone who sees clearly and chooses wisely, who understands human nature well enough not to be surprised by it, and loves it enough to keep showing up for it anyway. Go build a life on reality. It is the only solid foundation there is.